Politics and Economics, 1971 through 1980.
Did you know President Nixon rarely talked to Vice President Spiro Agnew about government issues or policies? Appealing to Middle America. Many Americans supported the government and longed for an end to the violence of the 1960s. The 1968 Republican presidential candidate, Richard Nixon, appealed to people whom he called Middle America. He promised them peace in Vietnam, law and order, a streamlined government, and a return to conservative values.
The term Middle America is exactly the kind of term you're going to see on a test.
The Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, and a third-party candidate, George Wallace, could not stop Nixon as they split the Southern vote. Nixon won, receiving 43.4% of the popular vote.
Notice how, with 43.4% of the popular vote, Nixon did not win by a majority of the electorate. Also notice that George Wallace, a racist who ran on segregation, won 5 states in the South.
Much of Nixon's success in the election came from the South. Nixon had promised to appoint conservatives to the federal courts, to name a Southerner to the Supreme Court, to oppose court-ordered busing, and to choose a vice president acceptable to the South. As a result, a large number of white Southerners left the Democratic Party and voted for Nixon.
This marks the shift from the Southern white voters who voted for Democrats since the Civil War to voting for the Republican Party.
After his election victory, Nixon began the Southern strategy to win even more Southerners to the Republican Party. He took steps to slow desegregation.
Nixon was a smart politician. He knew exactly what the white Southerners in the South wanted, and so he gave it to them with his desegregation slowdown.
To keep his promise of law and order, Nixon set out to battle American crime. Nixon criticized the Supreme Court regarding expanded rights for accused criminals. He appointed several conservative judges to the Supreme Court, including one from the South.
These party platforms or ideas are the strength of the Republican Party in places like our southern states.
Nixon's Republican leaders dismantled several federal programs and gave more control to the state and local governments. Under Nixon's New Federalism program, Congress passed a series of revenue-sharing bills that provided federal funds to state and local agencies. Intended to give state and local agencies increased power, it actually led to a greater dependency on federal funds. In 1969, Nixon proposed replacing the existing Aid to Families with Dependent Children welfare program with the Family Assistance Plan. The plan would give needy families a guaranteed yearly grant of $1,600. The program won House approval but was later defeated in the Senate.
Now, $1,600 a month doesn't seem like much now. It also wasn't much then. Although the average income now is much higher, back then it was about, between $10,000 and $15,000 a year. So you can see $1,600 a year was not going to help needy families very much.
Why did Richard Nixon appeal to Middle America in the 1968 presidential election?
Remember how I mentioned that the term Middle America would resurface on a test question? He aimed many of his campaign messages to Middle America. Nixon promised them peace with honor in Vietnam, law and order, a streamlined government, and a return to more conservative times.
Nixon's foreign policy. President Nixon's administration focused mainly on the subject of foreign affairs.
Picture of Richard Nixon and his wife Pat on the Great Wall of China. Nixon has long been noted as the president that opened up relations between the United States and communist China.
Nixon chose former Harvard professor Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. Nixon and Kissinger put their foreign policy in place and attempted friendlier relations with the Soviet Union and China.
Remember why he did this? It was because he wanted to make our withdrawal from Vietnam easier by trying to be friendlier with our main adversaries during the Cold War. If you recall, this was called linkage.
Nixon was anti-communist, but came to reject the idea of a bipolar world with the United States and the Soviet Union confronting each other. Nixon felt the multipolar world would need a different approach. With the help of Kissinger, Nixon created the approach of détente, or relaxation of tensions between the United States and its two major communist rivals, the Soviet Union and China. Nixon argued that the United States had to build a better relationship with its rivals to ensure world peace.
Remember, it's called détente, not detente.
To ease tensions with China, Nixon lifted trade and travel restrictions and withdrew the Seventh Fleet from defending Taiwan. In February 1972, Nixon took a historic trip to China, where both leaders agreed to better relations between the nations.
Particularly like this picture of Nixon. I'm sure that it's taken at a particular moment where he was enjoying his food, but it looks like he wants to spit it out.
After learning of the negotiations between the United States and China, the Soviet Union suggested an American-Soviet summit or high-level diplomatic meeting in May of 1972. Nixon became the first president to visit the Soviet Union. During the summit, the country signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, to limit nuclear arms. The countries agreed to increase trade and exchange of scientific information.
It is perhaps ironic that the United States as a country realizes that too much weaponry is dangerous and could lead to war. When you look at it as individuals, many in our country think that we never want to limit our right to bear arms because that would make us unsafe.
What views on foreign policy did President Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger share?
Now, this question should be easy for you to answer. Both believed in a gradual withdrawal from Vietnam. Remember, that was called Vietnamization. A practical approach to foreign policy, to continue to contain communism, and to use engagement and negotiations to achieve international goals. In other words, we had to start talking to our enemies.
Did you know television covered the Senate Watergate hearings from May to November of 1973? The hearings were popular among daytime television viewers.
Now, for those of you that don't know what Watergate is a hotel and convention center in Washington. And so it was used for, as most hotels are, for conventions and meetings, from corporate groups to political entities. And it turns out that the Democratic National Headquarters was located in offices in this Watergate complex.
The roots of Watergate. The Watergate scandal began as the Nixon administration attempted to cover up its involvement in the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, as well as other illegal actions committed during Nixon's re-election campaign. Richard Nixon had become defensive, secretive, and resentful of his critics during his long and difficult climb to the presidency. He went as far as creating an enemies list naming people from politicians to members of the media. In an effort to win re-election, Nixon and his team looked for ways to gain an edge any way they could. On June 17, 1972, 5 Nixon supporters broke into the Democratic Party's headquarters to locate campaign information and install wiretaps on telephones. Discovered by a security guard, the burglars were arrested.
When the news came out, and it was on the front pages of newspapers all over the place, nobody could quite believe that the president had initiated this break-in. They couldn't believe that the people that were involved could be so stupid as to the way they got caught. They were doing things like taping the door jambs in order to prevent the doors from locking, and retaping them after the tape was discovered by security guards.
One of the burglars, James McCord, was an ex-CIA official and a member of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, or CREEP. As the questions about the break-ins began, the cover-up started. Although some think that Nixon may not have ordered the break-in, it is believed that he did order the cover-up. Many Americans believed the president when he claimed he had no involvement in the break-in, and Nixon won re-election in 1972. Why was Nixon's hope of re-election uncertain?
Although he had a high approval rating after the summit meetings, the unpopular Vietnam War still dragged on. Nixon's staff was worried about the close margin of the 1968 victory.
The cover-up unravels. In 1973, the Watergate burglars went on trial. Defendant James McCord agreed to cooperate with the grand jury investigation and the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, established under Senator Sam J. Ervin of North Carolina. McCord's testimony created a floodgate of confessions, and officials and White House staff exposed illegalities. Counsel to the president, John Dean, leveled allegations against Nixon himself. John Dean testified before Senator Erwin's committee that Attorney General John Mitchell ordered the Watergate break-in and Nixon was active in its cover-up. On July 16th, White House aide Alexander Butterfield testified that Nixon had ordered a taping system installed in the White House to record all conversations to help him write his memoirs once he left office. These tapes were sought by all groups investigating the scandal. Nixon refused to hand over the tapes, pleading executive privilege, the principle that the White House conversations be kept confidential to protect national security. In the fall of 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced to resign after it was discovered he had taken bribes from state contractors while governor of Maryland. The Republican leader of the House of Representatives, Gerald Ford, became the new vice president.
So this is something that never happened before. The vice president is forced to resign for his criminal acts which were discovered, and now we have Gerald Ford, this guy that was appointed to this position, and you know what's going to happen. Nixon will resign, and Gerald Ford will become the only president we've ever had that was not elected to executive office.
Nixon released edited transcripts of the tapes in April 1974, claiming they proved him innocent. Investigators went to court again to force Nixon to turn over unedited tapes. In July, the Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to turn over the unedited tapes.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach or officially charge Nixon of presidential misconduct. On one of the tapes was found evidence that Nixon had ordered the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation of the break-in. On August 9, 1974, Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford became the 38th President of the United States.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
What did the House Judiciary Committee charge against Nixon?
Nixon was charged with obstructing justice in the Watergate cover-up, misuse of federal agencies to violate the rights of citizens, and defying the authority of Congress by not turning over the tapes and other materials the committee had requested.
The impact of Watergate. Watergate prompted the implementation of several new laws limiting the power of the executive branch and re-establishing a greater balance of power. The Federal Campaign Act amendments limited campaign contributions and set up an independent agency to administer stricter election laws. The Ethics in Government Act required financial disclosure by high government officials in all three branches of government. The FBI Domestic Security Investigation Guidelines restricted the Bureau's political intelligence gathering activities. Watergate left Americans distrustful of public officials. Other Americans felt that Nixon's impeachment and resignation proved that in the United States no one is above the law.
Of course, some people felt just the opposite, because Nixon was never officially charged with crimes. He was pardoned shortly after Gerald Ford gained office, and he lived in luxury for the rest of his life.
What did the Watergate scandal do to Americans?
Try to take this quick quiz and see if you can answer the questions.
Did you know President Carter held fireside chats on the television and radio? He also held phone-ins so he could talk one-on-one with Americans.
This is one of those embarrassing terms because we had sit-ins, and then later when college professors wanted to talk about the Vietnam War, they had teach-ins. Now he's going to call his, when I mean he, I mean Carter, he's going to call phone calls phone-ins.
The economic crisis of the 1970s. During the 1970s, the economic prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s began to disappear.
This is a time in our history when we had to have kind of a reckoning for some great economic times that we had after World War II. You see, after World War II, we were the largest manufacturing industrial giant in the world. We could supply goods to the whole world, and we were able to gain tremendous prosperity. But by the 1970s, the world had caught up, and we started facing a lot of competition, especially from Japan.
The economic troubles began under Lyndon Johnson's leadership. He increased federal deficit spending to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society program without raising taxes. Pumping large amounts of money into the economy created inflation, or a rise in the cost of goods.
You see, when there is a lot of money floating around in the economy, people tend to spend freely. And then retailers begin to raise their prices because they can. So we started to see inflation, that is, the rise of prices, and the cost of living went up because everything followed. The real economic trouble started a little later when we found that we were no longer competing as well on the international stage with our manufacturing sector. And as we began to lose jobs to our foreign competitors, we had an additional stress, something that we didn't see coming.
In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced an embargo, or the stopping of shipping of petroleum to countries that supported Israel. The price of a barrel of crude oil increased from $3 in 1973 to $30 in 1980.
It's the oil that made the big difference in our economy, because all things stem from the price of oil. Oil is energy which makes the world go round. It fuels our trucks, which means it fuels our deliveries of goods and products across the world, and it also is used in manufacturing for everything. So, with the price of oil going up, that means is more inflation.
Even before the embargo, President Nixon and Congress imposed price controls on gasoline and heating oil. After OPEC raised its prices, the price controls created an oil shortage. Increased international competition for manufactured goods added to the economic problems. U.S. factories closed and workers lost their jobs. The U.S. economy faced stagflation, the economic dilemma that combined rising prices with economic stagnation. Nixon focused on controlling inflation by cutting spending and raising taxes. Congress and many Americans opposed Nixon's idea of a tax hike, as well as his other ideas on how to end stagflation.
To be fair to Nixon, stagflation was something that we've never seen before. Generally, when prices go up, the economy has problems, but that usually means prices go up because there's a lot of money in the economy. But we saw something else happen. As we lost our manufacturing jobs, our unemployment went up, which meant there were a lot of people with less money to spend. So why did prices continue to rise? It's because of the oil embargo and the oil shortage. Because the price of oil went up, it pushed the prices of everything else up. So we were scratching our heads wondering, well, how can we have high unemployment, less money being made by the workers, yet prices are going up? So Nixon tried to fix it by controlling the inflation side. Okay, see, he cuts government spending. That means perhaps then you could lower taxes. But he doesn't lower taxes. He raises taxes. So naturally that didn't work. But nothing that any president did afterwards worked either.
What caused the economic crisis of the 1970s?
The answer is fairly complicated. The crisis began to take shape in the mid-60s when Lyndon Johnson significantly increased the federal deficit spending to fund both the Vietnam War and the Great Society program without raising taxes. That way you began to see inflation. This pumped large amounts of money into the economy, which caused inflation. The rising cost of raw materials, especially oil, also added to inflation. In 1973, OPEC announced an embargo on petroleum to countries that supported Israel. OPEC also greatly raised the price of crude oil. By the early 1970s, the U.S. economy suffered from stagflation, a combination of inflation and recession, two things that aren't supposed to occur at the same time.
Ford takes over. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford granted a full pardon to Richard Nixon. Ford's approval rating plunged from 71% to 50%.
Here we have a president that was never elected to executive office, and he immediately becomes unpopular because he pardons Richard Nixon. But his more immediate concern is not his popularity. His immediate concern is how to deal with stagflation. Do you deal with the recession problem, or do you deal with the inflation problem? Since both are occurring at the same time, he has to choose one or the other. The problem being, nobody knows how to deal with it.
By 1975, the American economy was in its worst recession since the Great Depression. Ford attempted to revive the economy, but his whip inflation now plan failed. He tried to limit federal authority, balance the budget, and keep taxes low. He also vetoed more than 50 bills that Congress had passed during the first 2 years Ford had served there.
His plan, the whip inflation now, sounded kind of hokey at the time, and it never gained wide acceptance by the American public.
Ford continued the foreign policy of Nixon. In August 1975, Ford met with leaders of NATO and the Warsaw Pact to sign the Helsinki Accords. Under the Accords, the parties recognized the borders of Eastern Europe established at the end of World War II. The Soviets promised to uphold certain basic human rights, but later went back on this promise, which turned many Americans against détente. Southeast Asia also continued to be a concern for Ford when Cambodia seized an American cargo ship.
The Helsinki Accords were perhaps a good pact to make. We didn't have to give up much. We all we had to do was recognize the existing borders of Eastern Europe, which had been existing for ever since World War II, but we didn't want to admit to. The Soviets, they had to promise certain basic human rights, but of course they lie, and so they didn't uphold their end of the agreement. A lot by this time, Americans were reminded why we weren't speaking to the Soviets, because whenever they made a deal with us, they tended to renege on their deal.
In the election of 1976, Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter won with 50.1% of the popular vote. Carter was seen as a person of high morals and an upstanding personality.
Carter was a Washington outsider, a governor of Georgia, and a peanut farmer. He was known as being a very religious man and a very moral man. And at least he was elected with, by a very small margin, a majority of the popular vote.
Carter battles the economic crisis. President Carter focused most of his attention on the energy crisis. His efforts were unsuccessful.
Carter will long be remembered as a fairly ineffective president in many respects. But he was an extremely intelligent man. Although he was a peanut farmer, before that, he had gained a degree from Annapolis, the Naval Academy, with a degree in nuclear engineering. He correctly understood what the problem was, and that's going to be energy. But like the presidents before him, he was completely unsuccessful at dealing with it.
Carter proposed a national energy program to conserve oil and to promote the use of coal and renewable energy sources. He had Congress create the Department of Energy. He asked Americans to reduce energy consumption, which most Americans ignored. Right-wing conservative scholars have suggested that Carter's difficulties in solving the nation's economic problems were the result of his lack of leadership and inability to work with Congress. A 1979 public opinion poll showed that Carter's popularity had dropped lower than President Nixon's rating during Watergate. How did President Carter propose to improve the economy?
He tried to end the recession and reduce unemployment by increasing government spending and cutting taxes. Inflation increased, however, so he decided to delay the tax cuts and vetoed spending programs he had proposed to Congress. He reduced the money supply and raised interest rates. He tried to rally American support for a war against rising energy consumption. He proposed a national energy program to conserve oil and to promote the use of coal and renewable energy sources. He created the Department of Energy, and he asked Americans to reduce energy consumption.
Carter's foreign policy. President Carter's foreign policy focused on human rights. Carter won Senate ratification of 2 Panama Canal treaties, which transferred control of the canal to Panama on December 31, 1999. President Carter singled out the Soviet Union as a violator of human rights because of its practice of imprisoning people who protested against the government. Tensions deepened as the Soviet Union invaded the Central Asian nation of Afghanistan in December of 1979. Carter responded with an embargo on grain to the Soviet Union and a boycott of the Summer Olympic Games in Moscow.
As you might imagine, Carter's high moral stand might have been correct in the sense that he was battling against human abuses by the Soviet Union. But when the United States learned that we were no longer going to participate in the Summer Olympic Games because they were located in Moscow, people howled.
In 1978, Carter helped get a historic peace treaty known as the Camp David Accord signed between Israel and Egypt. Most Arab nations in the region opposed the treaty, but it marked the first step toward peace in the Middle East. In 1979, Iran's monarch, the Shah, was forced to flee, and an Islamic republic was declared. The Shah was supported by the United States. The religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini distrusted the U.S. Revolutionaries stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage. The hostages would not be released until Carter's last day in office, some 444 days in captivity.
As you might recall from our previous chapters, Iran held a grudge against us because we helped topple their government and install a dictator in their country. It was all a Cold War strategy that we used to secure European rights to oil in the region. But now our past came back to haunt us with an eruption of anti-American protests, and then later the hostage crisis.
What were President Carter's foreign policy successes?
President Carter's foreign policy focused on human rights. Carter won Senate ratification of 2 Panama Canal treaties, which transferred control of the canal to Panama on December 31, 1999. He singled out the Soviet Union as a violator of human rights because of its practice of imprisoning people who protested against the government. Carter placed an embargo on grain to the Soviet Union and a boycott of the Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. In 1978, Carter helped get a historic peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt, known as the Camp David Accords.
Did you know during the 1970s, children's programming on public broadcasting focused on educational shows such as Sesame Street and Zoom?
Fat. Cat. Sat. Hat. Fat. 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 Cat. 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 Sat.
sisters and misses and misters, here's your daddy-o with the sounds to go. No shucking, no jive, and I'm telling you, your music's arriving. Ha ha, what I say. It's Mel Mounds here with our special request game called The Same as Your Name. That's right, one of you lucky listeners out there will get a chance to pick the next song. And the name of that song will have a sound that sounds the same as your name. I'll show you just how it works, but first, let's pick the picker. I'll spin now a pick of the pack picker, which contains the names of all you fans out there who sent in postcards. And we'll just pick out the name of today's lucky winner, and it is Brenda Bradley. That means today we're going to be working with the BR sound. That's br, as found in Brenda Bradley. Okay, now let's call Brenda up on the phone, and here's her number.
The Search for Fulfillment. Writer Tom Wolfe labeled the 1970s the me decade, referring to the self-absorbed attitude of the American people. Some young Americans looked for fulfillment through an array of secular movements and activities that made up the New Age movement. Believers in the movement felt that people were responsible for and capable of everything. They believed spiritual enlightenment could be found in common practices. Some Americans looked to new religions or cults. Many new religions originated in Asia and centered on the teachings of a guru or a mystical leader. One of the best-known gurus, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, led a religious movement known as Transcendental Meditation, in which it was thought that with daily meditation and silent repetitive mantras, peak intelligence, harmony, and health could be reached. By 1970, 60% of all women between the ages of 16 and 24 had joined the workforce. American family life changed with the increase in women working outside the home. This resulted in smaller families, parents and children spending less time together, and a rise in the divorce rates. Why did some young Americans look to the New Age movement for fulfillment?
Some young men and women were disenchanted with the conventional religions of their parents.
Cultural trends in the 1970s. Television changed during this time, reflecting many of the changes taking place in society. The Mary Tyler Moore Show placed an unmarried woman with a meaningful career at the center of the show. Taboo subjects like racism were addressed in the 1971 show All in the Family. By carefully mixing humor and sensitive issues while not preaching to the audience, the show made viewers examine their own feelings about social issues.
Yeah, all right, Edith, just leave it there, huh? Oh, look at this, will you? Meat prices up again by 8%.
Maybe we ought to turn vegetarian. It'd be cheaper and healthier.
Oh, well, I ain't saying that, because it ain't natural. Man was put on this earth to eat meat.
The music of the 1970s had a softer, more reflective, and less political sound. The rise of disco music became the craze in African American and Latin nightclubs. The fast pace and loud, persistent beat attracted fans. Several other fads became popular during this me decade. Skateboards, t-shirts with personalized messages, mood rings, and Citizens Band radios all became popular during the 1970s. Fitness was a trend in the 1970s. Aerobic fitness was introduced, and men and women began running and joining gyms as a social activity.
Breaker one, this is the Bandit, it's the Snowman. out there? Am I hitting you, son? Mercy sakes, you put about 8.5 on me. Blowing my windows down. Bring it on.
This is Foxy Lady Bandit. We heard you were coming by, and we decided we'd take care of those bears for you.
You some bitch. Don't you cuss on this here radio.
It's just good old boy language. I've never known anybody who got on a CB radio in America, whether he lived in Michigan, and suddenly got very southern.
Welcome to Aerobicize, the beautiful workout. Aerobicize is a fun way to improve the quality of your life. Start gradually, simplify the movements if necessary, and try to do a little more each day. We're not setting goals or making demands. Just do what you can. The thing to remember is be patient with yourself. Stay with the music and remember to breathe out. More oxygen increases your endurance. Aerobicize is for you. Enjoy it.
Been a lot of changes over the years.